So first, let me introduce our first guest speaker today, then Ian, as I mentioned. Ian's head of workplace for EMCOR UK. It's one of the facilities management companies in the UK. And Ian also has just been appointed chair of the Institute of Workplace and Facilities Management's special interest group looking at workplace. So Ian does that on the side of his day job. As part of his role, so Ian is the client-facing workplace consultancy lead. So he looks at how can workplaces really contribute to an organisation's productivity, employee engagement, health and well-being. So Ian, being a strategic thinker and real agent for change in these organisations, he brings together that data also with his knowledge and skills as one of those workplace leaders. So he wants evidence-based designs that improve workplace performance, and that's what he does with his clients. He's been working with United Utilities. So United Utilities, as you may know, in the Northwest, large water provider, helping shape their future workplace. And so Ian's now going to talk to you about the consultative and evidence-led approach that he used at United Utilities. So thanks very much, and over to you now, Ian.
Well, that's a fantastic introduction. Thank you very much, Ben. Really appreciate that. Let me share my screen. So yes, good morning, everybody. I want to introduce myself because Ben's done a fantastic job. I was going to be joined by the customer. So we did this as a joint project with our customer. Unfortunately, the lady Sian Taylor has got COVID for the third time, so she's not in a position to be able to present. But this is a project that we started back in September 2020, I think, really, where we all of us started to get a bit frustrated with the amount of headlines that were talking about how workplaces were going to change, and obviously how COVID was going to be affecting the way that we work. And we came up with a proposal to United Utilities to use some space to actually measure and to do some research into how specifically it affected them and their employees. So that's what we're going to talk through today. Right. So United Utilities, just a bit of background for them. They're obviously a relatively large water company, 42,000 kilometres of water mains. They have space up and down their area. They have over 140 farms on their site, so it's a huge infrastructure and drive for water regulatory and make everything as good as it can be. They obviously all have issues, as you might well know, but they're mainly run from a site called Lingley Mere, which I'll show you in a minute. So when we started working with them, obviously it was mid-pandemic. Everybody had been sent from home. Some people had stayed on site and some people had just started to come back. And we discovered this really great model from Andy. Obviously, you might have seen this on your Smart Working Network page. I'm trying to get rid of the top of this banding. Sorry, just a minute. Just trying to. I can't get that. So Andy had produced this model, and I've simplified it because it was very complicated. And we used this model to look at the UU workplace to figure out where they were in this journey from a very traditional unchanged office to a smart hybrid world. And they believe that there's somewhere between controlled and flexible hybrid. Not everybody. Some people are a little bit more office based, but in the whole, they felt that where they were was somewhere in controlled, and this was obviously being driven from COVID. They own the campus, which we'll come on to in a minute, which adds another layer of flexibility and complexity into how they use that space. So that's where they thought they were. Specified days in the office sets what normal looks like, flex by request and office rotas, but they wanted to move towards more of a flexible hybrid model. So the campus is up in Warrington. It's been there for about 30, 40 years. There's an element of a ring road around the campus, and inside that ring road are some very traditional, what they call red brick buildings that have been there from the start. Some more modern buildings have been created in the bottom right-hand corner and again in the top northern area of the site. And what we discovered is that a building called Clearwater 4 was empty. We recently, just at the beginning of the pandemic, completed a project to refurbish a building called Windermere, which is the square building on the left-hand side, and that's their main call centre. So during that process of refurb, we'd decanted everybody into Clearwater 4. We'd finished the refurbishment, moved everybody back into Windermere, and Clearwater was therefore empty. And what we decided that as it was empty and as people were coming back into the workplace from the lockdowns, that we could use that building as a trial site. It was already empty. We weren't going to be wasting any spaces in doing this trial thing. So we had this space. We thought, what would we do with it? And the research project kind of was born from that ability, which is quite unique. And at the time, we hadn't heard anybody else that were trying to do that. So before it was being used, it was very, very traditionally laid out. As you can see, just rows of desks. Most of the sites at United Utilities are allocated spaces. They have so much space that's just how they've continued to work. This building was no different. It was allocated desks. It's a really good building, though. It's got lots of natural lighting, lots of natural ventilation. It's a space that you can open up the windows in, which was quite useful as we were coming back from COVID. We obviously had to have quite a lot of ventilation. But traditionally, it's a very, very fixed and rigid and unchanged space to work. So what we wanted to do was take that space and not just let people come back into it and see how they worked. What we wanted to do was change the space almost in a way where we were taking the headlines that we were getting a little bit frustrated with people are going to come back to collaborate, or the office is dead, or people are going to come back for meetings, whatever they were. Use that kind of foresight and design a space that would meet that requirement, and then let people come back into it and see how they used it. So this was the unique factor. We were largely using the people as guinea pigs to ratify the expectation that everybody had as people came back from COVID. So money is obviously a bit of an issue when you're doing these kind of things. So what we did is we hoovered up all of the unique pieces of furniture that had spread around across the site, and we put it into this building. We still had some workspaces. We didn't want to go so far that we got rid of all of the desks, so we reduced that down to about a third, but more likely about a quarter of the desk spaces. But then we added in lots of extra little bits and pieces, so focus chairs, concentration areas, some focus pods. We really amped up the collaboration zones, and this was sort of the top right hand side of the screen is a bit of a Zen quiet zone area. So we had lots of collaboration spaces that we put in, and we gave them different names, so people could come and use project spaces or drop in Teams chats, etc. Support and social areas as well. And we were lucky enough to have 2 floors to do this over. So we inserted an amphitheatre, still some additional desks, but again, as you can see from that layout, lots of ancillary spaces, and they had a strong demand across the site for project areas. So these are areas where people can come in and drop in for 2 to 3 months. So we included those as well in that location. And what we wanted to do with that, and the original plan was that we would open it up in September 2021 with 5 months of continuous monitoring. So what we'd plan to do is a dedicated hybrid working survey, like once a month. And then as we gathered that data and saw that things were changing, we would then potentially tweak the spaces and then do some pulse surveys as we went along, so that we could, monitor really, really closely how they were using that space. That was our intention, and best wills and best intentions. We were slightly Omicroned when in November, obviously, we all back into lockdown again. So we ended up having survey data from September and a couple of pulse surveys during that month. We had a bit of data that came in October, and then everything pretty much shut down, and we then reopened it back up again in February, March the following year. And so what we've ended up with is a really nice way that we can compare September 2021 to March 2022. And what we discovered was that productivity and community actually went up in the period between September 21 and 2022, although the strong confirmations of that had changed, gone down. So it was a bit of an odd thing, that although it had improved, the strong expectations had gone down, but well-being, the strong expectations had increased. So we were very enthused by that. We knew that we were on the right track, and that these 5 elements of our survey, the environment, productivity, community, pride, and well-being, had all been really, really strong proof that this space was working. So we had that as our happy baseline. I think pretty much as everybody expected, and we were talking about this before you all joined, about the expectations of working throughout the working week. Mondays were suspiciously low, but throughout the rest of the week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays were very high, and Fridays began to drop off across the entire site. And this building was actually open up to be used by everybody across the site. So where people were coming back in and they might have been expected to go back into their building that they'd used pre-COVID, they were still allowed to do that, but most of the meetings and most of the socializing and collaboration elements that they needed to do were moved into Clearwater for. So we were really giving them something new that they hadn't had before. So we obviously needed to know from that group what the working styles were that they were most trying to use in Clearwater for. So we gave them a choice of mainly desk-based, were they highly mobile within that office, mobile away from the office, or were they largely remote with occasional site visits. And what we discovered in September 2021 was kind of no major surprise. 54% of the people using the space were largely remote. When they did come into that space, 31% of them were allocated desk-based. Very, very low numbers were moving around within the office, and 12% were moving around the office and away from the office. So we were kind of expecting that. This is just at the end of the 3rd major lockdown, I think, when people were coming back in. So there was a lot of residual memory there. By March, however, let me just move on again. By March, we'd seen that the largely remote crew had dropped from 54% to 44%. The mainly desk-based people had dropped from 31% to 21%. And encouragingly, The highly mobile people had increased from 4 to 11%. So we were getting much more movement within that Clearwater 4 building, and as well, the 12% to 23% had been highly mobile outside of the office too. So there's a big increase in people moving around and much less usage of people coming in and sitting at a fixed workstation. So we were quite encouraged that the hybrid model was working, and the space that we had provided was doing a good enough job. Throughout the time, we obviously had sensors. We had occupancy sensors monitoring how people were using the space. And what we discovered fairly quickly was that nobody was really sitting at the desks. People weren't coming in to sit and focus. They were coming in to do the collaboration and the meetings and to socialize. So these areas started to drop off quite quickly. And the same was seen on the top floor as well. There was a different group of people that were using the top floor, but again, workspaces were being pretty much underutilized between those two periods of time. So what we wanted to work out was, what were they coming in to do, and what was the most important thing that they were coming into the space to use. So again, choice of 5, being able to work at a desk, use a meeting room, work without distraction, because we know that obviously not everybody has an amazing space at home. So some people do need to come into the office to work and focus. The ability to collaborate with colleagues or to socialize with colleagues. Interestingly, what we saw between September and March was that the ability to collaborate with colleagues was the number one thing that people wanted to come back in to do. And I guess that isn't a huge surprise, given that we had all been locked away and had been just doing Teams and Zooms calls for nearly a year by that point. Over a year by that point. So that was quite a unique and interesting stat for us. And there was a bit of a change, but nothing huge, 95 to 81% between the two periods of time. The next thing that we thought was interesting was working without distraction. Sorry, as well, the brown is positive and the blue is negative on these graphs. So working without distraction had increased. It was more important in March. And again, that could well be that there was an increase in people coming back into the space, and as they were socializing and collaborating, they're creating more noise and more hubbub within that space. So those people that had come back to focus and to sit at those desks were finding it a bit of a struggle and a bit noisy, and that had increased from 38% to 60%. And then the interesting one, socializing with colleagues, was quite important in September 2021, and had dropped off the list quite significantly by March, and we were kind of surmising that might well have been because people were reminded that they didn't like their colleagues or something, or they'd come back and they'd done all the catching up, and then they didn't think that it was a particularly interesting necessity, or it might be that they were doing it somewhere else. So that by that point the central cafe area had opened up on the site again, so it might be that they were scoring this for Clearwater, but they were catching up and socializing with colleagues either elsewhere on the site, or, as now they could do, away from the office. So that had dropped from 65% to 37%. The thing that we were trying to avoid and capture with some of this stuff was this swingometer effect, and forgive that slide, but we knew that if we'd made some decisions on the data that we'd gathered in September, and there were some elements of the organization that were very desperate to start making decisions, we knew that if we'd made those decisions in September, come March, they wouldn't have been the right decisions to have made. So we were trying to match this swingometer effect and let the data settle down to a point where we're comfortable that what we do on that site will have some longevity. It might not be 1 year or 2 year, but it'll have a bit more longevity than 5 months. And so our future plans for the site is to continue monitoring this. We've been monitoring it since March. The site, as it was pre-COVID, was a very traditional site: 66% workstations, 12% collaboration meetings, social interaction areas. So, mostly desks, mostly the car park is rammed every day, and people go to their desks to work. And what we're moving towards, as the data has kind of supported, is much less workstations, and trying to focus people to be more our space and sharing space rather than my space, and to increase the collaboration, the concentration, and the social interaction areas, so that the mix of the site will change over time, and as people come back, and potentially that spread of Monday to Friday hopefully will increase as we increase some initiatives into that. Then the usage of the site pro rata will come down, and that will mean that hopefully we'll be able to reduce some of the space. So one of the ideas is that the ring road with the red brick buildings inside it, which were the original buildings, could become the hub of the organization, and some of the outer buildings outside that ring road might be either leased out or sold off, or kind of used in a different way. So that's where we were aiming to go to for that. And the key takeaways that we wanted to share really is that socializing with colleagues in the office spaces has reduced, or it's potentially happening in other locations. Collaboration and attending meetings are the primary reasons that people seem to come back into the office, and I don't think that hasn't changed since March. It has potentially meant that there are more people coming back to work and to see people, but that's the primary reason. And the types of spaces that we created, we were confident had contributed to a better workplace experience post the pandemic. And what we're going to be doing with that building is extrapolating all of that learning and moving it into one of the red brick buildings on the main site, which is a bigger space. And the idea is we'll be supporting 450 people to work in a hybrid, agile fashion, and reduce the number of desks. And we're only doing that because we now think that the swinging pendulum on the site has slowed down to a point that we're comfortable with that decision. So these decisions are beginning to be made, and we'll be continuing to monitor how it works and how the site develops their workplace and their hybrid strategy. So that's the end of the presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ian. Lovely overview there of how you use data to drive your decision making. So if you wouldn't mind taking down your slides at this point, and I know there's been a lot of questions that have come through, I think what we'll do, in the interest of time, we'll take those questions at the end of the session. So what I'm going to do now is just share again the topic that Andy's going to cover with us. So hopefully that's coming up now. So Andy's now going to be talking to us a little bit on how we're going to tackle the dilemma where management are starting to mandate how many days in the office that people are going to spend, and that general dilemma that the offices face. Should they be mandating it, or should we allow people to make up for themselves when and where they want to come into the office? So a little bit of context on Andy. Many of you know Andy. He was, of course, one of the founders of the European Smart Work Network that you're joining today. So for those who haven't met him, and for those who are joining this session for the first time, Andy is an absolute specialist in implementing agile and smart working. He's been an advisor to the UK Cabinet Office and also the European Commission. So some of you may have seen that he was the technical author for the British Standards Guide, that's PAS 3000, Code of Practice for Smart Working. And he's guided many programs of change, especially in the public sector. And he also worked at Thales, my previous organization, defining the approach to smart working there. He's also the author of Smart Flexibility. Those who've seen it, the big purple manual. Sorry, my slide is blocking it a little bit. But loads of great insight there, and it's a guide for management on how you actually do it, the practicalities of implementing smart working. And he's also led several studies on the future of work. For example, It's Work, but Not As We Know It is one of his recent studies. So over his 28-year career in this field, Andy's worked with dozens of companies, lots of government sector organizations, and developed those integrated strategies, but also how do you actually implement it and roll it out on the ground? That's one of Andy's specialisms. So without further ado, let me hand over now to Andy to look at how we do overcome this dilemma of when we should mandate whether or not teams should be in the office. So Andy, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ben, for that introduction. And thank you everyone for attending today. And also thank you to the people who sent some feedback that I asked for, to give a bit of insight into what you're doing so that I could tailor the presentation to what people are focusing on at the moment. Yeah, so we can look at how many days in the office. And I think the key thing here is really the connections between workplace, time, activities, and choice. So there's a natural link with what Ian has been talking about, because what you do in deciding how often people are going to be in the workplace obviously interfaces with the kind of spaces that you provide and the amount of them. So I think one of the first questions that we want to look at really is which comes first. It's a sort of chicken and egg question. Well, on the chicken side, we have the workplace specifications, what Ian has been talking about, the amount that you need. We'll have a quick look at that, the locations, the settings. And on the other hand, the egg side of things, the time together in person. How much time should you spend in person? Because they really impact on each other. For example, if you're specifying that you want everybody to be in the office, as some organizations have done on one day, that's going to severely limit any ideas you have of space reduction, and is also going to impact the kind of spaces that you have available. And again, it will lead to the space being pretty redundant on other days, but we'll explore more of that as we go along. So look at how much space we actually need. I thought we'd start off by looking at some trends, which are quite clear now. I think there's a lot of debate during the pandemic about whether people would start reducing offices. It seems to be quite ubiquitous at the moment. Here's a sort of graphic from the Financial Times showing the amount of office space that's reduced. That's from the Valuation Office Agency. And it's a trend which started way back in 2014, and it's been greatly accelerated. And most organizations I've been talking to are going to take this further. On the right there, this is about in the legal sector, Clifford Chance, one of many organizations that are getting rid of some of their spaces, consolidating. And I know that in other organizations like the European Commission, for example, which is consolidating some of their space, it also has the advantage of bringing some people together for the first time as departments or units that have been spread around. So I think that the expectation of time on site are a key enabling or constraining factor, and we've got to work out how best to consider this. So let's look first of all as a kind of continuation from Ian's presentation. What's the evidence for how much space and the balance of settings that you have? How can you find that evidence? And there's a range of ways, consultation, sensor data, all the things, I won't read through them all. They all have certain advantages and disadvantages. With consultation, one of the things is, are people really thinking with their what they can do, or is it their traditional ways of thinking about things? With booking systems, people inevitably overbook for the space. Badge data tells you people are in the building, doesn't tell you what they're doing. And do they actually need to be there? External benchmarking, well, do you want to follow the herd or do you want to be a leader? Workplace design workshops, your workplace designers tend to come along and will offer you various options, and some of them will nice. Or do you have no way of finding out? Someone just decides what the workplace design will be. So what are organizations doing about where to work and the amount of time you should be in there? Well, we find that there's quite a few large organizations specifying 3 days per week in the office. BT, which have got quite a track record of flexible working, and now have a basic principle of 3 together, 2 wherever. and it runs alongside a program of reducing something like 300 workplaces to 30. So you've got these big hubs, very nicely designed, but they'll become much more the center for, want to be an attractor factor for getting people in the office that they don't just have to go there, they should want to. And you've got Apple and Google along the same lines. Specifying 2 days per week, there's a few government departments doing this, and many businesses. And for some, it is particular days of the week that are being specified. For others, it's just 2 days or 2 days on average. Then there is organizations leaving it to individuals and or teams like Simpress or Slack. And I think Simpress is quite an interesting one because they made some assumptions about needing drop-in centers, and they found that in some places these were greatly underused and have gone to using co-working spaces instead. And then there's a percentage or number of days over longer periods. Thales is an organization which is going down this route, an overall guide internationally, very slightly from different countries according to their experience. And then it's agreed by teams according to the local situation and the nature of the work that people are doing. And I think we've got Isabel on the call. Maybe she'll chip in during the panel session to tell us more about it. And then we've got organizations lurching chaotically one way than the other, like Twitter. So please do add what your organization is doing in the chat box. So what are the reasons for being together in the building with other people? And I think these are some of the reasons. I won't read through them all. They will be quite familiar to you. I think some of them are good reasons, some are bad reasons, and some are yes, but reasons. Now, the top one, we have our offices and they're underused, is one that I've heard on several occasions, and some that we heard from politicians in the UK as well about getting people back to the office. We're paying for all this, we ought to use them. It doesn't strike me as a very good reason. It's reason to rethink, isn't it? How and where people work. And hands-on or site-specific work can bring people in the office, but we're going to have a look at some of that a bit later as well, about how the nature of that is changing. And then there's various other things like team building, generating new ideas. And I think these are the kind of yes, but reasons. There are very good reasons for getting together in person, but also, should we be thinking of new ways of doing it then on a more virtual basis? Should we be rethinking the processes by which we generate new ideas, and how do we use a mixture of asynchronous and synchronous communications to make a difference? Can we do more in co-creating work rather than everyone going off on their own, doing something, then having a meeting, then doing something else on their own? Get a lot of it done more dynamically. So the other thing is, how do these translate into whole days? And I think that is one of the sort of particular challenges. I just want to have a quick look at what people actually want. There's been a whole range of surveys over the duration of the pandemic and as we go into the post-pandemic period. This is one of the more recent ones from McKinsey, and there's another one from Owl Labs and Global Workplace Analytics, which have very similar results. Now, this is in America for people who can work remotely or have the offer to do that. And working completely remotely is becoming much more popular. And what we're finding with these surveys, I don't know if it's the same in your organization, is that the majority of people do want to work most of the week from somewhere else, whether that's home or wherever. But again, I think this kind of home or office thing is a bit of a narrow conversation, and we'll explore that a bit more in a moment. So if you're thinking about specifying 3 days together, you need to have good reasons as to why that's the case, if you're finding that your workforce are thinking, well, we can do this differently. So how is it decided how much time to spend on site? Do the individuals decide? Do teams decide together? At this point, I'm going to have a little poll. Let's see. Just get the poll up and running.
Thanks, Andy.
Can you
That's
see that
live
now?
now. Yeah.
Good, good, good. So if you just want to have a few minutes voting on that, see the variations. And I think there's some interesting ones in here. There's a few organizations I've come across recently, often who have got a bit more in the way of customer interface or hands-on work, who are making decisions on the basis of role categories. So they divide people up into role profiles, and that gives different levels of availability of the option to work somewhere else. We've still got some votes coming in there.
Yeah, it's peeled off now, so I think we can look at the results.
Okay. So if we share the results now, it's interesting. So it is more from the audience that we have here, more individuals and teams deciding. Organization-wide mandates are still quite numerous. And it's interesting if there's to find out maybe in the panel session whether there's some kind of tension there between the people who are creating the smart working options and the hierarchy, which is giving an organization-wide mandate and the processes by which they are agreed. We've now got a second poll, which I'll just relaunch now. So this is how much time is required being on site. Are we getting a majority at the moment coming in for individual choice? I'll just a few more people voting. I'll
Yeah,
end the
let's look
poll
at the
now,
results.
share the results. So yes, individual choice is quite an interesting one to come out in the lead. Specified number of days per week, 2 or less. Very few going for more than that, and some for the percentage of time. So it'd be very interested to see how these are actually worked out in the panel session, or share it in the chat box. So moving on, we've got quite a lot of organisations at the moment that are still working on things and working things out. This is quite a challenge for me in updating my books at the moment, in trying to get sort of completed case studies. I thought it was quite interesting when Ian was saying that there's what people think at first is not necessarily what they think later, and that was particularly in relation to socialising. And so I think it is quite hard actually for teams and organisations to work things out. And I think there's 2 important caveats for interpreting data. It's great to collect the data. One is, what's the state of awareness of the possibilities for working smarter or much smarter? And one of the things that we constantly find is that there's a bit of a cognitive bias comes in, what's called functional fixedness. That is, that people default more to what they're familiar with. So how can people start to think in new ways? The data mostly tells us what people are doing rather than what they could be doing. So when we interpret the data, we've got to also think and go back to people and say, well, if we did this or that or the other, it's not a straightforward process, not a quick process, I should say. It's one that needs a few iterations and a bit of testing and learning to find out. The other thing is to beware the seduction of averages. You may get some consultation comes back with a figure of 2 days a week or 3 days a week, and so that then becomes the default. But actually, how many people are actually average? Different kinds of work have different kinds of considerations. So I would like to inject more flexibility where possible. What I'm going to do is give a little bit of a guide here to one way of trying to think a bit more in the round about how to decide the amount of time spent on site. And I think one of the time is to try and get away from this concept of remote work and the workplace. So this is one of the figures from the editing of my book. So we've got four physical domains of work. And we also have a fifth domain, the virtual workplace. And rather than just focusing on home and one of these places, we need to think of where people need to be, when they interact with customers, when they may spend a lot of time actually at a client partner site. So if you have a blanket rule about being in the office, what does that mean for people who are more mobile? People getting together for socializing, for brainstorming or whatever, any good reason to be together, or for a heart-to-heart, is one of these main workplaces, the company-owned workplace, is it the best place? Or could it be in a public place or some other third-party owned space? When we come to the personal domain as well, we need to think as well about what the home is, the various settings there. And there's various settings within a home which are desirable. I think the Leesman surveys, which have looked at this, have found that around 40% of people have got their own space where they can shut themselves away to work. Others haven't. So the ideal situation for the home, if people are working there a lot, needs to be considered as well. And it may be that one of the other spaces, co-working space or something, would be preferable on occasions, not necessarily the company office, especially if that's going to generate a lot of travel and so forth. We've also got various things up here which you're welcome to ask me about, like workation centres and holiday locations. A little bit contentious, but they are places where people work. And one way to sort of come to the decisions is, this is I think Ben and some others will be quite familiar with this, as I've used it in organizations, is to get people to think not about the roles, but about work tasks, where they are done, how time specific, how time variable, how location specific or location variable. And so if we take someone like a safety officer, we could just put safety officer has to be on site, available all the time. But actually we start breaking it down, we get critical safety incident down here, quite time specific and location specific. Safety inspections over here, and then the reporting will be somewhere up top right, perhaps. If we think of team meetings, we may have a bit of time variability, but they're always on site traditionally. Do they have to be so? And we can move them somewhere else. Classroom training versus e-learning. Report writing versus classified reporting. Lab work, you think has to be on site, and lab analysis, lab work planning, and so forth. There's a whole range of things which come into these categories. And then,
Apologies, Andy, we're just a little over on time if we're nearly wrapping up now. A ton of questions we want to answer with the panel. Thank you.
I just brought these in because some of the feedback that I got was about having the toolkits and guidance. So I was just sort of showing some quick examples here. So this is some of the critical choice factors that come into play, and dependencies as well. So about the time together and so forth, with customer preferences, critical collaboration needs, security, and so forth. I'm happy to share some of these with people if they want to get in touch afterwards. And we're also looking at different changes in the types of work as well, with the kind of hands-on work. And the point from this one really is that there's a whole lot of systems and applications and place-independent activities coming out of hands-on work as hands-on and site-based work becomes more knowledge-based. And some of this can be done remotely, needs remote access, including activity-based work settings in the corporate office. And in some cases, people need physical access to their facilities. And what you're finding is we can't just assume the death of the office. It's that there's a whole lot of other office-type work coming along, and we need to think about how that interfaces with hands-on facilities and with all the places in the extended workplace. So chicken and egg, the answer. Neither comes first. It's really a question of first design the work, then design the workplace and agreeing in-person arrangements. And these were my 5 conclusions. The more time is mandated in the physical workplace, the more the smart use of space and the effective use of people's time is negatively impacted. Awareness raising is essential, not least at senior level, before taking key decisions or making policies. We need to go beyond consultation, engaging the workforce in complete rethinking of how work activities can be done. And we need to avoid designing virtual working around old habits of place and proximity. And finally, to build a culture of trust and management by results, it's best to provide high-level guidelines, advisory frameworks, and then leave it to teams and individuals to decide the details. And at that point, I shall stop. Forgive me for going over slightly.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Andy. And for those who aren't familiar with our website, if you want to download some tools and templates, I know Andy's put a lot of content up there, so do have a look, smart-work.net. So just welcoming back now Ian, and also our third panelist as well, Philip, joins Andy. So we've got the three panelists today, and we're just going to go through some of the questions that have come in, a lot of them during Ian's original presentation. So I'm going to put them to Ian and say, how did you overcome some of these challenges? And then also ask Andy and Philip around best practice and what other organizations have done, if that's okay. Sure. So I'm going to go first of all to Ian then at United Utilities. Did you allocate the workspaces to specific teams or services, or did you have free flow?
No, we didn't allocate any of the space, actually. The Clearwater 4 area was open to anybody on site to go and use. That was a slight change to how we originally planned it. We'd originally wanted to allocate 350 odd people to that site, so we had a bit more of a controlled group, but they opened it up to everybody, and it was, yeah, completely free for all.
Okay, great. And maybe moving to Andy, I know some organizations use neighborhood zones or other ways to allocate space to teams. What's best practice and what are most organizations doing?
I think there's still this practice of allocating team zones, not necessarily with allocated desks. There's still continuation of the idea of having a desk ratio, but I think these things need to be very flexibly applied. Some teams need some space much more than others. And so it's best to have the flexibility, not to have a kind of blanket rule across. And I think there is a move away from having team space at all, looking at much larger units where people have to go into a space and then having an area they can use when they do come in. Otherwise, you can have a lot of redundant space on the days when people aren't there.
Makes sense, yeah. And Philip, any further thoughts on that?
Well, not really, but I have questions for Ian. So when I looked at your floor plans, past and current, it seemed like a private space called a studio for a person like the old days is no longer visible. Is that the product of a sort of open landscape tyranny? Because you see clearly that people are saying, well, we found that a closed personal private space at home seems to be good and productive for us. Your people are coming back and saying, look, we need more concentration space. Would it be the bridge too far to have not necessarily a dedicated, but at least a space that used to be called a private office in the past?
Yeah, I mean, for that site, just reminder that there are other buildings with that availability in it. So if there is a requirement for that, you could find that somewhere else. There was another question. I'm sorry, Ben.
That's a bit of a shame, really, right? Because I think you guys know damn well that these kind of private spaces would be much appreciated, even in the new locations that you're designing, right?
Yeah, I mean, we had pods that were a bit more private, and there were some smaller meeting spaces that could be booked out. But in terms of senior people needing spaces, or anybody actually, sorry, needing a quiet space, yeah, it would have been available elsewhere.
It's very hard to find. It's very hard to find a place for that, right?
Just going to say that in practice, what we've found, I've come across several organisations where they've introduced quiet space in these private pods, and they can be really seriously underused. So I think it's one of those things that comes into this category of, you can do a bit of test and learn. See, people always say they want it. Do they need it so much?
And who wants to sit in a phone booth for an hour? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And they're very tight spaces, right? It's little cubicles often.
Ridiculous.
So I'm going to move us on then to measuring the benefits. And a great question here from Stuart Watts. I really like this one because it goes to the heart of what the businesses are doing. So Stuart's asking, how do you get people to report an increase in productivity? Is it all subjective self-reporting, as in they felt they were more productive, or did they have some form of measurement on improvement against their own KPIs or business KPIs?
Yeah, it was self-reported, and what we were trying to get at is the space making you productive or unproductive? So when you're coming back into it, are you able to access the things that you need? Are you able to access the people that you need? So yeah, it very much self-reported. I think Annie mentioned Leesman. It's a kind of a Leesman-ish. Does the workplace enable you to be productive? So it was that we weren't about to start hitting people with KPIs as they come back into the office after COVID. But there is productivity is a really difficult thing to measure anyway. It's a whole hour on its own. So it's something that we will probably look at going forwards. But yeah, it was self-reported at that point.
I think
and Andy, Philip, any thoughts on productivity?
Yeah, well, I think frankly, what we're forgetting is that most of us are working for somebody, right? I mean, if you're a freelancer, it's working for a customer, and he's going to decide whether he likes the productivity and the value. Similarly, if you're in a corporation, small or big, you may have a boss, if you still want to use that. And therefore, the boss most probably, if he's a good boss, he should be able to say whether he feels more productive than before, beyond the person itself judging whether the use of his time is of value that will be valued in terms of money promptly.
Yeah, and that's the same thing with this, working from home, that there's an increasing drive in this business to say to people, you need to be back in 2 to 3 days a week. I'm yet to find out what the push for that actually is, but people that say, my staff are working from home and they could be in the garden. Well, there are still KPIs and they still have targets that they need to fulfill, and if they don't fulfill them, then that's where there's problems, isn't there? You can still see that from their outputs, whether they're from home or in the office.
I think at the moment we're getting a bit of a divergence in some surveys that we're seeing about employers, senior managers being less certain about these productivity increases that are self-reported. If we go back into the literature, nearly all pre-pandemic, focusing on teleworking or home-based working, it's kind of almost universal that people do report increases in productivity, mainly if we're getting away from distractions. And there are some indeed which have been done from both sides, from the manager's side and from the employee side, which tend to confirm this trend. However, I do think that when we look at a future where you're much more contactable at home and you don't get away from the distractions and so forth like this, that it is one extended workplace, we need to think quite differently about productivity and anchor it back much more to monitoring the output in much more granular ways.
I'm going to move on. We've got a question from Tara around the concept of a team, and is the concept of a team becoming redundant? So she said it was interesting to see Ian's data showed a decline in socialising with the team members as one of the reasons to come back into the office. So is that concept of having one unit that you work within becoming a bit redundant here?
I mean, I really hope not. The concept of teams, that is a real driver of productivity and performance. And there's a great article on LinkedIn recently about the power of friendships at work. You can't have friendships at work without developing a team. And I guess this is the challenge with when you let people come in when they want, that if there's a certain number of people in a team and they're all spreading their days across the week and they're never really sharing the same space, that's where people are kind of creating a bit of a problem. And I think, Andy, one of the polls that you did was, who dictates when you come in, the team. And I thought that was quite a good solution rather than the senior leaders. Socializing with people, I mean, I just think that was happening more outside of the office come March, as we were able to do that. And if you had friends at work, then you were able to see them outside of work, whereas you couldn't have done that in September.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, we've seen concepts in other organisations where teams will agree between them what days of the week they'll come in versus other teams, and then they can share the space effectively by coordinating, by saying, you guys come in on a Friday, we'll come in on a Tuesday, avoiding those sorts of clashes. I know we did a little bit of that at Tallis at one point. I'm gonna move on to Sophie's question. Sophie says, you mentioned the tendency to default to old habits and patterns of behaviour. Perhaps this even relates to people going back to the same old desk every day out of habit. And of course, we are creatures of habit as humans. How do you combat this?
I think it was me that said that in the presentation. I think it's really a question of getting people to engage with their work tasks, like I briefly demonstrated, and rethinking what could be improved is getting that in kind of improvement conversation. How can we use the new permissions that we have to work in different places, the new technologies that we have to make a difference? And I've seen all kinds of interesting things coming out of this. People who used to have these big sort of inspections after the end of a project phase, lots of people tramping off to a place on site, things being done by video and by drone. People know that this is the kind of thing that should be done, gathering a lot more data that can be looked at off site. And you kind of get people's interest developing like this. So you get this kind of improvement mentality. And then they can start applying that and relating that to the different ways of working.
Well, I think the adoption of what a lot of us know, but by the way, we're preaching to the converted here, right? We know all the principles, we know activity-based working. I mean, it's very clear that we have not insufficiently succeeded in conveying to people what the new options are, yeah, and how you go about doing that. And unfortunately, a lot of what we are doing as specialists is targeting large enterprises, which are not even, I would say, employing half of the world working population. So there's a lot of people in small and medium-sized companies which have not even seen what the new world is like. So I think we need to continue on a path for adoption, explaining things much simpler. Activity-based working, for instance, has never been whittled down to something that people can easily understand. In activity-based working, energizing, which is essential to fuel up your tank, is not even in there. Now, if you ask me, if people are continuing to work the way they currently do, sitting behind a desk, much too long, fixed position, well-being will knock on their shoulder at a point in time and tell them that there are alternatives that have been available for a long time that they better start using. Do we want them to hit the wall at 45 or 55, particularly the youngsters? We don't want to, right?
Yes, exactly. And I'm going to go to the last question now. It was from Ruth a little while back. She was asking about getting stakeholder buy-in. Now, her point was specific originally to the basically senior managers wanting their own space and having their own offices, which we alluded to. But if we broaden that question just a little bit, Andy, I know you do a lot with stakeholders to get them bought in and involved in the process. Do you want to outline a little bit on how that looks, both for senior leaders and the broader population?
With senior leadership, I think that two things are important. One is that they actually dedicate some time, whether it's a couple of hours within an away day or 2 days away, whatever, to really engaging with how this impacts an organization strategically and elevating the whole workplace conversation to the highest level. Often it's just seen as a kind of add-on. Somebody else will deal with that, our property people. It's really quite crucial now. And also having a process whereby gathering data through interviews and talking to them and trying to capture their interests about what can be improved, as I was saying before, and how the new ways of working can relate to it. If you also have the kind of data that Ian was showing and the big consultations around it, numbers talk very powerfully to senior leaders. And I think that's quite an important way of getting them on board.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I think there's quite a bit of work to do to get leadership in the flexible / smarter working saddle. Andy and myself have had the pleasure of working with companies that had an accelerated education, understand what others have done, and then embracing it to spectacular degrees. Unfortunately, they are still in the minority. It's not a surprise. A lot of these guys have over-specialized educations, be it engineering or law, doesn't really matter, but they don't really know the human dimensions of working, right? They cannot even spell biophilia, let alone ergonomics. Yeah, and here we are. They want to do well-being, but they don't understand that there's a whole world of specialization expertise that they can tap into. So we need to do better in awareness and consideration towards leadership at large.
Fantastic. Well, I note that we're over time, so we are going to have to close there. But Ian, thank you again once so much for you coming along and sharing your example from United Utilities and the sorts of work that your company does. Great presentation, lovely use of data, really visionary with how you transform that office floor plan and even sharing that with us. So thank you so much. I know we got a lot of interest on that topic and great attendance as a result. So appreciate
Thanks
it.
for having me.
Yeah.
And Andy, as always, thank you to our Andy. Sorry, go on. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'll just say that I will pick up the unanswered questions in the chat.
Fantastic. And check out our website, of course, as well, smart-work.net, where the recording will be hosted. So thanks to those who are asking about that as well. Look forward to seeing you in 2023, hopefully for a physical event, and we'll probably do a virtual one in late January as well. Look forward to seeing you then. Cheers all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank
Len.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.